Hello everybody. In this video I'm going to be showing some analysis of a recent tournament I played on Lichess. It was the monthly classical arena, which was, I believe, 20 minutes for the whole game each with a 10-second increment. But if you chose to berserk, in which you gain more points for the win but your time is halved, you would then have 10 minutes flat. I can't show every game because I played, I believe, 37 out of my games, so I'll show you 5 of those 37, which I thought were interesting matches. And there were about 4,800 players who participated in the tournament, and it was 6 hours long, and I was playing for about 5.5 hours. So it's the first time I've really tried to actually win the tournament. And in this first game that I'm showing, I was playing against someone who's almost 2,500, so I assume that they're fairly strong over the board, maybe FM or IM strength. And in this match, I decided to play a sort of system, this sort of closed Sicilian without d4. And there's not as much theoretical knowledge as there is on the main line, d4 opening after e4, c5, knight f3, e6, d4. So this way I sidestep some of their prepared theory, and we are now simply playing a game. So I've essentially tried to keep the opening kind of preparation out of this game. And with my bishop e2, I prepare to castle on the king side. Black decides to gain lots of space with the a6, b5 push, maybe fianchettoing their bishop on b7. I play d3 to less out my other bishop. They fianchetto, and I put the bishop on e3. Knight c6, and castles. I'm simply trying to control the center. I don't yet know entirely where my pieces will be, but I'm assuming that I'm going to attack in the center and on the king side, because black has already staked out a lot of space on the opposing queen side. h3 is chosen mostly as a kind of a safety move to prevent knight g4 getting my dark squared bishop if I wasn't careful, and also giving luft for my king on h2, so there's no back row checkmates in the future, and also to play knight h2 in certain positions where I can then play f4. Bishop e7 was chosen by black, and queen d2 connects the rooks. We are now out of the opening. Castles, and because I knew I would attack on the king side and the center, I then played a move which is probably a bit inaccurate. I played rook a e1, and my plan was to push my f and e pawns later on. But possibly rook a d1 is stronger, so my other rook that's now on f1 has the choice of e1 or staying where it is. Black pushed in the center with d5, gaining more space and threatening pawn to d4, which would fork my knight and my bishop. I would have to lose one of them. I played e5, counterattacking on their knight, and he retreated while keeping the attack on my pawn. I defended it and prevented black's pawn push to d4 at the same time. Takes. And if I take with my knight, I'm going to drop my e5 pawn. So I took with my bishop, black took back, and then I recaptured. At this stage, even though I've given up the bishop pair, black still has both. As it's a somewhat closed up position, I'm not sure that the evaluation of this is so bad. Black's probably a touch better because they have the two central pawns, and I only have one central e or d pawn. And the bishop pair is worth something, but my greater space and piece activity, I think, give me practical chances. Rook c8 was chosen, and I play bishop d3. Both of us have improved pieces. The rook is now on the open file, and my bishop is now pointing towards their king. Knight b6, attempting to play knight c4, which would attack my pawn and push more of their pieces on the queen side. My queen has no future on d4. I slide it across to attack the enemy king. Black continues with their plan, and I evict the knight from its very useful c4 square, upon which knight a3. My knight on c3 is now no longer defended, and the black rook is lined up with it, and I will have to address that issue. I play knight e2, again trying to come over to the king side where I'm strongest. Black takes the chance to take my pawn. I save the rook. I don't really want to trade off my bishop yet. It's such a useful piece in controlling the centre of the board and also attacking the h7 pawn. And black's knight is a bit awkward for me, but I think my bishop is better than their knight is worse for myself. Knight b4 is chosen, attacking my bishop and the a2 pawn. Also, their bishop on e7 is guarding their knight, so I shouldn't take it with the queen. I drop back, defending everything. Black plays h6, preventing me from doing any bishop takes pawn sacrifices in the future. And I then swing in with my knight to f4. And I thought here I was fairly comfortable with my position. I know I'm still a bit worse. But again, in this game where we've both berserked and have about 8 minutes each, it may not be who's playing the best moves. It's mostly, you know, who has the greatest chance to blunder a lot of the time. And black chose the move bishop g5, which looks okay because if I move my f4 knight, I will lose my rook. If I take their bishop, they could take back with the queen, trade off the queens, and comfortably be ahead. But in these types of positions, with all these pieces pointing at the black king side, I felt like I had to have a tactic, or I had to look at tactics at least. And eventually I found a really interesting move, which I wasn't certain if it worked, but it looked very complicated, and it does turn out, after the game, when I had a look, that the computer gives this as being one of the best moves. Knight takes e6, aiming at black's queen and their rook in a fork. So if black moves their queen, I can take off their rook, or even take their bishop a few times. And in order for black to sort of prove they have advantage, I think they have to take up the challenge and take me. I take back with the queen, check. And if the king moves to h8, this is very unfortunate because I have all sorts of ideas involving queen g6 and checkmates on h7, using my queen and bishop as a battery. Therefore, black plays rook f7 to block the check. I capture the bishop, so it has no way to take my c1 rook, which could cause me issues in the future. They have to take back, because my knight was also attacking their rook. And I can now jump in with bishop g6, attacking the pinned rook. Black has no way to save it, so they have to do some damage control with rook c7, defending their rook. I remove it from the board, black takes back. I capture the rook, and they take back. And here I was looking at trading queens, but I think with 2 pieces for the rook, black still has the advantage. Therefore, I have one other key player that hasn't done a lot for a while, which is my e5 pawn. If I can push it a little bit more, it will become a very large source of counterplay and potentially winning me the game. I gained a tempo by attacking their knight, where black essentially has to move it or defend it in some way. And they came forwards with knight d3, controlling the centre with the knight. Very reasonable move. I pushed. Queen e8, stopping me pushing all the way to the end. And I push again, because I think if I can play maybe queen check or queen d8, I might have the win. And there was also another reason that I did this, which will be revealed in a moment, because black played king f7 to attack my pawn, and if they can gang up on it enough and capture it, I think I'm worse, or losing. Therefore, with the king on f7, it's finally time for my f1 rook to get involved, and I shove f4. Black is now really in trouble, because if they take with their knight on f4, I'm sure I have other things as well, but I have g3, which will pin the knight, or it's already pinning the knight, but it will attack and win the pinned knight. And if we have the game with black taking the pawn, I will trade off the queens, then capture the knight, and it will be similar to the game, where I will be better if not winning, and should be able to close out the win in this position here. That's why, in the game, black took with their pawn. And then I played rook f3, so that black's knight is attacked, and there's no way for black to defend it. They decided to lose their knight overall. If they chose a move like knight c1, then I do have things like rook f4, king g8, and then can you see the move I had planned to win the game very quickly? The move I have is queen e6. If they block with their queen, I can either take it or promote to another queen. Their king will move. And then rook h4, and their king is in a mating net. Their only legal move is to play queen h5, upon which I can take the queen, checkmate. That's why black gave away their knight, with taking on e7, trying to hold the game with bishop and a surplus of pawns against my rook and pawns. Activated their king, and then I played g3. This was mostly to remove the f4 pawn so my king could come to d4 in a straight line, essentially, a diagonal line. If I get my king to d4, it should be an easy win. Black doesn't want to take me, and I do the honours, capturing them. I still can't take d5 because their bishop is still protecting that pawn. So I come in with the king. Black comes back with king e5, centralizing, although maybe g5 was a touch stronger as a move. Rook g3, and king f6 is essentially forced, and this allows my king to come in to d4. King d4. Then, the next stage is looking for the weak black pawns to target, and I eventually saw that a6 is the only pawn that is not being guarded here. Can you see what I did to win the game by going after that pawn? Alright, so if you play king c5, it might still work, but they do have moves like sort of g5, and when the king comes in, maybe bishop c8 holds, or maybe black can even push the pawn with d4. And my king is no longer centralized. This probably does still win, but I didn't want the hassle of working out whether it was indeed winning, so I played b4. Holding their pawns on the light squares, they can no longer move them, and after black's next move, rook a3. So black will unfortunately drop at least 2 pawns in exchange for my h3 pawn. For example, if king e7, as a move, rook takes a6, bishop takes pawn, because black is trying to get rid of as many pawns as possible and trade them all off. Now I can take on d5, and I should easily be able to catch the g-pawn whilst also attacking the b5 pawn, and I don't think black has a way to save both of them. And worst case scenario, if black does something like king f7, and then guards the pawn like this, I can always play a4. Takes, rook takes, and my pawn will eventually be pushed up the board and win the game. So, albeit it's a little bit tricky here, but I should be able to win relatively comfortably anyway, without having to resort to that. So that was the first game. They resigned after the move rook a3, which was played here. On to the next game. Again, I'm playing a reasonable player, 2150. And I'm black. I berserked, as in I did this most of my games, to be honest, over the 6 hours. In this game, we've got an Alekhine, where black essentially is trying to provoke white to shovel their pawns up, creating weaknesses. But on the other hand, white will have gained a lot of space by pushing their pawns up, and has a more harmonious piece development. So black's essentially playing it long term, while white is playing in the short and medium term. And black will have to be very, very careful. But instead, white chooses to play knight c3. When I defend my knight, hoping they'll take me so I can gain more space by pawn takes back, they put their knight in the centre of the board, and I play d6, breaking, trying to get rid of their advanced e5 pawn. Now they attack me, and I drop back, betrayed. Then white goes a4. Now, this is normally not a bad idea to play a4, a5 as white, because then it will force me back even further, disconnecting my pieces and gaining even more space, while also improving their rook. But in this case, I had a move. I played knight c6, and when white played a5, I have a classic forking trick. Knight takes c4. When white captures back, I then have d5. So I've lost a piece in exchange for a pawn, but I'm about to win that amount of material straight back. Then play bishop e7. I'm preparing to castle. a6. This is essentially a way to try and put pressure on my queen side. If I take the pawn, they will take my knight. In a way, I ignore them by simply bringing out a new piece. White also ignores me and plays knight f3, castles, then h4. This is a very dynamic attacking move. It can't really work, or it feels like it shouldn't work, because I've developed a lot of my pieces, and white has only developed 2. I've developed 3 plus castling. So normally I would not be overly concerned with this. But I was a bit afraid of my defences being stretched, with their a6 pawn being on the board, and obviously that other pawn charging at me. So I played pawn takes, thinking they would do something like queen c2, which would attack my knight and the pawn on h7, and I was looking at playing moves like knight d4 and just giving up the h7 pawn. But instead, I had to play a lot more accurately, because bishop takes h7 was suddenly thrown in my direction. I think I have to take the challenge, and then knight g5. And here you can take the knight with the bishop, you can run your king forwards or go backwards to where it started. What would you play as black? Right, so if you play king g8, which looks safest, white suddenly has this winning attack with queen h5, threatening queen h7. If I move my rook away, they still mate me, with the queen coming here. So if I play rook e8, they still mate me. And if I play the move bishop takes knight, they take with their pawn. They're still threatening queen h7 or queen h8 checkmate, because their rook is now guarding the queen. If I try and escape, giving my king a bolt hole with f7, they simply keep my king shut away, and it's game over. I'll be mated in the next few moves. I can play queen takes f2 check as a spite sort of check, making the game last a move longer. But I have no defense to queen h8 and mate. I think if I take the knight, the same thing happens. So I don't want to do that. I played king g6 because it was the only move I could see that didn't lose on the spot. White plays h5, and again, I can't take the knight because of reasons. If I take the knight, there's at the very least I could see d4 looked extremely dangerous, attacking my king with their bishop. Wherever I move, I believe queen f3 is mate. That doesn't work. Therefore, king h6. f4 was chosen to guard the knight, and while I could take it, and I indeed do, I was considering other moves. I was looking at e5 and bishop b7 and other developing moves, but I don't think I have enough time. I do think I have to take. And then when they take, importantly, don't take back. Run away with the king. White throws in another check, and I very stupidly play f5, thinking that this would block all the checks. What I had missed, of course, for some reason I'd sort of temporarily forgotten, that white plays en passant and check. Now I'm in a much more uncomfortable position than the last move, so I drop back to g8. They take me, and I think they're attempting to play queen g6, or maybe pawn h6, pawn h7, and possibly queening one of their pawns. Fortunately for me, I found a way to remove most of White's attacking forces. With Queen f2 check, and then, I think, a really strong move, Queen f1. What this does is it forces White to capture my queen, upon which I take it back, so I've lost queen for rook. When they move their king to the only available square, I have the knight d4 forking move. When they take my rook, I gobble up the queen, so we both lost queen for rook in the space of a couple of turns, so essentially it's just been a large trade. And I should be able to hoover up the pawns and win with the extra knight. But White plays rook a4. I have to be a bit careful because rook c4 almost traps the knight. Bishop d7 connects my rook a bit more with the rest of my pieces and coordinates better. And also, if rook c4 is chosen as a small trick, I had bishop b5, which does a pin on their rook to the king. White played rook g4, attempting to still kind of gain initiative and maybe some big attack using their rook and pawns. e5 to attack their rook through discovery from my bishop. They move the rook. I check them because I don't see what else to do. And they block the check, and then I play e4. So I'm still going for material and improvement to my pieces. I thought White might have played h6, but I think I have enough to not be scared of White's attack anymore. Bishop takes, king g1, and then I centralize the knight so that it can go to e2, which is a trick to win the rook, but also to f5. And White stops both of those with rook g5. I improve the rook, planning pawn e3. White continues trying to summon up some kind of attack with bishop c3. And then I decide to trade off yet another piece, like this, again removing White's attacking forces, and then decide it's time to launch a counterattack of my own using the passed pawn. If White moves the king too far away, I can play e2, e1, queen. They played king e1 to prevent this, but now the king is in a mating net. Rook b8, White doesn't have a good way to stop the move rook b1, checkmate. And that's why they resigned. So overall, not a bad game. This next one, I had also berserked, playing a 2250. And here they play a bizarre d5 against the English. If you play it against e4, it's considered fine because it's just the Scandinavian opening, where White has lost a central pawn and so has Black. But here, White has both their central pawns. So this changes the evaluation quite a big deal. Knight d5. And I elect to play a bit more aggressively than I have done the last few games with e4. Normally I would play knight f3 or even d4, simply trying to get a small edge and continue having that edge well into the middle game. But I choose this aggressive pawn thrust forwards, attempting to gain the space I need to win the game fast. But Black has this nice c5 move, playing it like a Grunfeld opening. If I play d4, my pawns can be attacked ruthlessly by Black. So I hold off on shoving with d4, and instead simple piece developments are chosen, along with the castling. And after e6, bishop e7, I feel confident enough that Black's c8 bishop is bad for now, so that d4 can be played and Black won't be able to unleash all their pieces onto attacking my d4 pawn. So I play it now. Black does trade, like in the Grunfeld, and in the normal Grunfeld, Black has already put the bishop on g7, not e7, so it's lined up with d4. They castle, bishop e3 to reinforce d4, which will be a key square for both myself and Black. Bishop f6, again proving the point of d4 being useful. And I get my rook out the way of any attacks from their bishop. And this was a provocation move, and I'm not entirely sure it's right. The idea I had was for Black to be forced to play b6, and then maybe I can pressure their knight on c6. But the move b6 helps Black more than it hurts them, because their bishop can fianchetto to b7. I think I should have done rook c1 immediately. So play it here, bishop b7. And I was thinking about d5, gaining space. But then maybe black has knight e5, which will trade off some pieces. And my pawn is isolated. If they trade on d5, my pawn will be isolated. So the more pieces are traded, the easier it is for black to round up the pawn. And I thought maybe I should play more carefully and put my other rook on d1, so that it's, again, sort of more carefully defending the d-pawn. Then I can think about pushing. And I meant to play rook fd1, but I had a sudden change of heart with e5. The bishop moved back, and then I shoved with d5, thinking that here maybe I'd got enough to start pushing here, and I can always play rook fd1 next turn when I have a spare moment. Knight a5, and I then played d6, attacking their bishop. The downside to this is that I dropped my bishop on c4, which I somehow missed. And this may prove the point of why I should have played rook fd1 instead of pushing those pawns. I've overextended, and now I'm clearly worse. I decided to play the move rook takes c4, dropping the exchange after I take the bishop. I thought maybe I had some compensation, but it turns out that I don't. After I play rook d1, black simply gets rid of my pieces, a bit like I did in the previous game. Here I don't have enough to really have anything in terms of counterattack, and black can simply choose to improve their pieces. And they play this move h6 to give their king a bit more air on h7, making sure there's no cheap checkmating tricks on d8 in the future. I play king h1 to maybe get the rook to g1, trying to get some kind of counterattack on their king. Rook c8, improving. And here I decide that it's time to launch a counterattack, because if I don't do it now, I think I've lost. My plan was, if they took my bishop, I can then play queen takes h6. And I think black may already be lost in this position, because rook g1 is a very hard threat to meet. Possibly black's best move is rook c1. And then I will have to trade the rooks off and win the rook back. And here I suspect it's level, or moderately level, because even though they have an extra queenside pawn, the b pawn, I have an extra h pawn, and my doubled up f pawns are not really worth much. So I suspect it's level there, but that's much better than being lost. Black did not take my bishop though. They played rook c2, which is still fine. Queen f4. It turns out there is a way for black to now get the advantage, but I think it's extremely difficult for a human to find. But black's move rook c4 to me doesn't really help them, because the rook on c4 doesn't really have any good places to move next, and this gave me the initiative I needed with queen g3 going for the mate. If black goes queen f8, I thought I had a nice move with rook d8, and the black queen is gone. If queen takes rook, I mate them on g7. If rook c1, I do not take the rook, because then black will take back and then be able to take my rook on d8. Instead, I can simply put the king on g2 and there's no more checks. And I've still got the same threats of rook takes queen and queen takes g7 checkmate. Black chose g6, but now it's lost after bishop g5. Black chose to resign because rook d8 is practically unstoppable. Queen c7, and there may be a stronger way of playing it, but I saw rook d8 was good enough, because if black takes my rook, I will take back, and I will have queen and bishop, 2 rooks, which is a win, or much better for me, plus several mating plans are unabated. And if king h7, I have queen h3 check, not h4, because the rook would take me, king over, and then 2 different checkmates. I would choose the picturesque bishop f6, where I'm using 4 pieces to checkmate them. The rook, the queen, the bishop, and the pawn, all playing a role. And if king g7 immediately after the check, I again have bishop f6, and then I could play queen h3, and I can also play rook d8, rook d8 to h8, checkmate. So black let that one slip away. That wasn't such a good game for my opponent. This next one, I was playing another 2200, sort of mid-level 2200. This wasn't one of my best games, I will admit. They start off with a London system. So I play my c5, which attempts to gain initiative and attack d4, but they continue without being put off, making a nice triangle of pawns and setting up in the usual London system fashion, which has been adopted by some top-level grandmasters. I choose a kind of Queen's Indian setup with a fianchetto on the queen side. White is often trying to play e4 or c4. So I play d5 now, which does allow white, after we both castle, to play knight to e5, gaining space and centralizing their knight on the outpost defended by the pawn. This knight's often very troublesome. If white can ever get their pawn on f2 to f4 and reinforce the knight, burying it in the center of the board, if I ever were to take the knight, they would take with the f-pawn, improving their rook on f1 and getting a really good kingside attack. So partly because of that, and also because the knight's so useful, I trade it off immediately. And yeah, if white had taken with their pawn, I would be very happy with the position, because their bishop on f4 would be blocked in. But they take with their bishop, which is the best move, and I now do the same thing, putting my knight in the center. The downside is I can't take with a bishop, so I am forced to double up my pawns, and I've gained a bit of space, but I have got these horrible pawns which block in my b7 bishop. I elect to trade off, try and go into an ending where I can hold, but I missed this d takes c5, where white now has a majority, 3 against 2 on the queen side, the a to d files, and I have a majority on the king side, the e to h files, but my double pawns are not going to be any use. Queen d4. I drop back. I don't want to trade queens with everything going on, although possibly I should do, because if I take with the queen, they take with the c pawn. They don't really have a majority anymore. My e pawn holds the d pawn in check. Both have 4 other pawns on the king side and 2 pawns on the queen side, and I can anchor my bishop with bishop d5. So this may be the best strategy. If they take with the e-pawn, then I do have somewhat of a majority with pawn f5 and then trying to play pawn f4 in the future and have good space. But instead I choose to drop back, and white improves, and so do I, putting our rooks on the open file. And my plan was for the white rook to take me where I can take with the pawn. And that does happen. I think I've equalized. But it turns out that my pawn on d5 is a lot weaker than I thought it was. It's a backward pawn. It can never catch up to its adjacent pawn on the e4 square. And if I can't ever push it forwards, as white is blockading me, it's also on the same color as the enemy bishop, where they will be able to swing around and attack that pawn over and over again. White masterfully moves their queen around to attack my pawn. I attempt to trade off, but white is not having it. Now has 3 pieces attacking my pawn. So I just barely hold the defense, and then they decide to push, which is a favorable trade, where white is now more active than I am, as I've tangled up my pieces to guard the pawn that was on d5. So white is not fixated with winning the pawn. As long as they have more active pieces, they should be happy to trade off my weakness in exchange for another one. As you can see, the white pieces are coming into my position. I'm trying to attack on the king side, but that allows white to win a pawn. I trade off, thinking possibly I can hold, being a pawn down. Rook check. Then rook a4, not taking the bait and taking that pawn on b6, which could lead to disaster. If queen takes b6, or mouse slip, queen takes b6, rook check, king h2, queen e5, and then if they play f4, I have the en passant capture, which will win the game after a move like g3, and I could probably play f2 and promote the pawn. And if white plays g3 instead, which is reasonable, queen f5, and the plan is to come in to h1 using my queen. Suddenly white is falling apart, and I don't see a way to defend this. Also, take on f2 is mate in 1, by the way. I was assuming white would defend the mate in 1 with something, although it's not easy to defend that as well. King g2 is probably the best move, and then queen f3. And rook h1 checkmate. But instead, white played the right move. Played rook a4, keeping tension and preventing my rook check. So I play queen f5, thinking rook d2 might be the plan. But white again stops me. Rook c5, rook c1 might be my idea. But again, they keep stopping my tactics. So now I choose to try and come round to g6 with my rook, line up with the king in a different way. But white again is able to stop my ideas in their tracks and offer the trade. Again, I should probably either take the trade of queens or play something better than I do. I played queen g6, holding the queen and rook on the board. Then f5, trying to defend. But this move weakens my king. Pawn moves around the king are not really desirable unless you have to make them. White decides to push their majority with a4, trying to go b4, a5, gaining a passed pawn. So I think my last chance is to, again, try to aim at their king with some checks. But I don't see how to do it. I play queen h5, trying to infiltrate. But white has similar plans with queen e6. I think I'm already lost. I play rook c2, attempting to play rook takes f2, and again gaining some time and initiative. But white plays the excellent rook d8. If they had played the move b4 and takes, then played rook d8, where you may think there's no difference and it's a safer idea to play b4, I believe I have a draw with rook takes g2, and then I think I have queen f3 or even queen e2, which I think holds the draw, because if white moves to the first rank, I go queen e1. If they go to the second rank, I go queen e2. And if they go to the third rank, then I believe queen takes e3 should be enough. And king h4 would lose instantly to queen g5 checkmate. And king back to the second rank again. I'm not going to mess around. I'll play queen e2. I have no chance of winning this. So perpetual check is the plan. But because they played rook d8 one move faster than that, I didn't have enough time. I played rook takes f2 anyway. Queen g8. And my king goes running away from their pieces, but it's not quick enough. And they checkmate me in style with queen g3. So very nicely played by my opponent, who was able to both defend against my own threats while creating their own, which I could not meet. So, very nice game. The final one I'll show is against the tournament winner, who managed to score an amazing series of wins, and who I suspect is also titled, because they are over 2450, which usually is only for the best players. In this game, it was a Vienna, which I tend to have good sort of success rates with, but I don't seem to be playing it enough. I seem to be playing these nice f3, like fried livers and Italian openings. And in the Vienna Gambit, I know some theory up to this bishop g4 move, and I know a bit more than this. So I believe d3 is actually the main line, but I play bishop e2 because it's easier. And bishop c5, attempting to play knight f2 or bishop f2. I prevent both with d4. And in some ways you may think black has lost a tempo because they put their bishop on b4 in 2 turns when they could have done it in 1. But with my d4 move, which has gained me space on the in the centre and queen side, it has allowed the pin. And bishop d2 is such a passive move that I hate it. I play bishop queen d3 to defend my knight in a different manner. Knight c6, castles to get my king out of any pins or whatever. And I thought they might go for some tricks with like bishop takes, knight, bishop takes, back, and then something like knight d4. This doesn't really work if I'm careful, but it's a nice move, because if I take with the queen, which is a little bit careless, they have bishop c5, which pins me, and will win my queen. But none of this is forced, so it's not a very good move. They played bishop f5, and I then actually made a fairly bad move, but it's in keeping with this kind of open game, where you're trying to gain the initiative of your opponent. I have a very badly placed queen and disconnected rooks. The best move is actually putting the queen one square to the right on e3, getting out of any kind of discovered attacks from their f5 bishop to take my queen. But instead, I played the move bishop g5, which is unbelievably complicated. And if they do knight takes bishop, which I was expecting at the time, then queen takes bishop, takes back, and maybe rook takes. I'm definitely the one who's got the initiative. I've got more pieces developed, and my a1 rook can come to f1. I'm threatening mate on f7 at the same time. This is the kind of thing I was aiming for. It turns out, though, that black does have the move knight takes c3. And what I was thinking might happen is I would probably have to take either the bishop or the knight, or the queen on d8. And I was looking at queen takes bishop, they take with their knight check, king f2, and they have to save the queen and also at the same time not lose their knight for nothing. So I was thinking potentially they could do knight takes d4, but they may indeed choose to simply play queen d7. Then after we trade queens, I can capture the knight, and possibly I'm doing okay here. This was my thinking, at least. But none of that happened, which is good. They played queen d7, so I've now played the right move, queen e3, getting out the way of their bishop on f5. Castles, and I traded on e4, because I couldn't see where else to put my knight, and I don't like their knight on e4. I took back, so now I kicked their bishop a little bit with c3, and this way I can put my rooks on a1, e1 I mean, from a1 in the near future. Black drops the bishop, and I then trade. Jump in with my knight. I'm trying to get the kingside attack again. This seems to be my style of play at the moment, just to go for the king. Bishop g6, holding the position, and now is the time to call up the reinforcements. h4, trying to play h5 and dislodge their bishop from having such a good presence on the king side. h6 to counterattack, and I choose to ignore the fact that my knight is hanging. I go for their bishop, and they save it, so I save my knight. Bishop back to e4, we're sort of jumping around a bit. And here I go knight h4, trying to get my knight to either g6 or f5 in the near future, while also possibly allowing queen g3 and my rook on the f-file. Black doesn't like the way this is going, so they choose to trade off the knights. Then I elect to make my a1 rook stronger by putting it on f1. To do that, I have to move the rook already there. Now I've doubled up the rooks. Black has managed to break and get their rook active. The only thing I have really is that my pawn on e5 is a passer. So potentially I can either deflect away their pieces to try and take the pawn at the right moment, so I can then counterattack and win, or I can keep this as a long-term advantage. Bishop e4, disconnecting my queen from the pawns. It's an interference tactic. Also centralizing the bishop and anchoring it on the e4 outpost. I need to improve my bishop as well. Bishop g4. They immediately go for the pawn, and I push it while also protecting it via the bishop. Black chooses to trade rooks. Again, the closer we get to there being no pieces other than pawns or kings, the better black's position is becoming. So I'm already a bit afraid that I don't have enough for my initiative. b6. I think black is planning c5, gaining space. But b6 doesn't really do that much. So I'm not sure it's the right move. I play rook f7. Again, trying my best to create some sort of tactic on the king side. Queen h4, going for my bishop. And I couldn't see a way for me to win without there being some tactic from black. So I play queen f4, improving my queen, connecting my queen and rook, guarding the bishop, getting ready to push e7. But black throws in a check. And I don't really want to trade queens, so I move the king. But black now comes back over to check me again. And repeats the position. So we get here, and I now think it's the critical moment of the game. Either I play king g1 and take the draw, or I play bishop h3 and hope my attack is enough. And here I did actually see a minor tactic, which is relatively interesting. So I thought, why not? Let's play bishop h3 and trade. Now, if black plays rook e8, which is not what they played in the game, I have several things, but I have rook f7 being one of the moves. Then I can play rook takes c7 in the future and possibly win because my rook is on the 7th rank, where it's extremely valuable. In the game, though, black played rook f8 to prevent this, but fell for my tactic. e7. If they take my rook, I will promote to a queen. It's game over. So rook e8 was chosen, and it doesn't really matter if they choose rook back to a8 or b8 instead. The tactic still works. I have rook f8 check. If the king moves, I take the rook and win. So they took my rook, or they would have done if they hadn't resigned. And here, bishop e6 check. If black chooses to block the check, this will allow my rook, their rook, to not be attacking the promotion square, so I can promote with ease, win the game. And of course, if their king moves to the h file, doesn't matter where, I can simply take the rook and promote to a queen again, winning the match. So they resigned in, I believe, this position, because they saw this was occurring. So in the actual tournament itself, there were, as I say, about 4,800 players. This person I played against did win. He got over 100 points in this classical arena, which was very, very impressive. There was another player who got just underneath that. Also very, very strong player. I don't think I faced them, though, in the tournament. And I came third, just barely edging out a German grandmaster. So overall, I'm very happy with the result of the tournament. I did lose some rating points because there were a few games I played absolutely abysmally, just blundering things over the 6 hours of the tournament. But overall, happy with the way things went, and hope you enjoyed the video. See you next time. Bye.